From the moment she could understand words, Emma Richardson knew she carried a legacy that wasn't entirely her own. Her father, Colonel Robert Richardson, had been a decorated fighter pilot in the United States Air Force, a man whose name was spoken with reverence, whose story was woven into the very fabric of military heroism. He had given his life for his country, and in return, his name was etched into history. But to Emma, he was not just a war hero, he was an absence, a void she had spent her entire life trying to fill. Growing up, she was surrounded by echoes of his greatness. Veterans who had served alongside him would pat her on the shoulder and say, "Your father was one of the best, kid. You've got big shoes to fill." Teachers, neighbors, even strangers who recognized her last name would remind her of his sacrifice, reinforcing the expectation that she would carry his torch. But what did that mean for her? Was she meant to follow a path that had been paved before she was even born? Emma found herself searching for her father in every way possible. She studied every old photograph, listened to every story her mother could recall, and memorized the few recordings of his voice that still remained. But nothing felt real, nothing made him more than just a legend. So, she made a decision. If she became a fighter pilot, if she stood where he once stood, if she flew the way he had flown, maybe, just maybe, she would finally understand him. But as she got closer to that goal, an unsettling question began to take shape in her mind. Was this truly what she wanted, or had she spent her entire life chasing the ghost of a man she never got the chance to know? Emma Richardson was everything the Air Force could ask for in a young officer, disciplined, relentless, and fiercely dedicated. From the moment she entered the academy, she outworked everyone around her. She was the first to arrive for training and the last to leave, pushing herself beyond exhaustion, refusing to settle for anything less than perfection. She graduated at the top of her class, earning the highest marks in flight evaluations and securing a coveted position as one of the most promising young pilots in the force. On paper, she was the embodiment of success. Yet, despite every accolade, every mission completed, and every milestone reached, something always felt just beyond her grasp. No matter how many commendations she received, no matter how many times her name was spoken with admiration, there was a lingering emptiness she couldn't explain. She had spent her entire life chasing the idea that if she could become as extraordinary as her father, she would finally feel whole. But the truth was, she had never truly known him, only the legend that others had built around him. Every time someone said, "Your father would be so proud of you," she would smile and nod. But deep down, she wondered, would he really? Would he see her as a reflection of himself, or would he recognize her as someone different? Someone who had spent her life not just trying to be great, but trying to be him. She remembered the long, sleepless nights staring at the ceiling of her barracks, questioning if she belonged. The adrenaline of flight training, the rush of takeoff, the freedom of soaring through the sky, she loved all of it. But did she love it because it was her dream, or because it was the only dream she had ever allowed herself to have? She had never let herself ask these questions before. Doubt was a weakness, and weakness had no place in the Air Force. But as she climbed higher, as she pushed herself further, the weight of expectation grew heavier. Was she truly honoring her father's legacy, or was she just trying to outrun the fear that without it, she might not know who she was at all? Emma had spent her entire life proving she was good enough. But good enough for who? For the world? For her father? Or for the version of herself she had never truly allowed to exist? When Emma Richardson received the official letter from the White House, she should have felt honored. It was an invitation to a special ceremony recognizing the most outstanding young officers in the United States military, an event where she would stand among the best, where her name would be spoken with admiration, just like her father's once was. But as she held the crisp envelope with the presidential seal, a quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered, "Why me?" She had worked tirelessly, given everything she had, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been chosen not just for her achievements, but because of her last name. Was this truly about what I've done? Or am I just the daughter of a war hero, fulfilling an expectation I never questioned? Arriving in Washington, D.C., Emma stepped out of the military vehicle and gazed up at the grandeur of the White House. She had spent years preparing for missions, navigating complex flight maneuvers, handling high-pressure situations, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. She adjusted her uniform, ensuring every detail was perfect, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she refused to let anyone think she was only here because of her father's legacy. Just as she was about to enter the main hall, a White House staffer approached her with a calm yet serious expression. "Lieutenant Richardson, the president would like to see you privately before the ceremony." Emma felt her breath hitch. A private meeting with the President of the United States? Her heart pounded as she followed the staffer down the long, historic corridors, her polished boots striking the marble floor with steady, deliberate steps. She had no idea what awaited her behind those doors, but she knew one thing for certain: whatever happened in that room would change everything. As she stepped into the Oval Office, her eyes were immediately drawn to the man standing behind the resolute desk. Donald Trump looked up from a file in front of him, studying her with sharp, assessing eyes. "Lieutenant Richardson," he said, a small knowing smile forming. "Thank you for coming." She snapped to attention, saluting crisply. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. President." Trump nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat. He flipped through the pages of her file, scanning her impressive record before locking eyes with her. "I have one question for you, Lieutenant. And I want you to answer honestly." Emma held her breath. "Yes, sir." Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and direct. "Why did you join the Air Force?" It was a simple question. One she had answered dozens of times before. But this time, sitting across from the President of the United States, the words that had always come so easily suddenly felt empty. She had spent her whole life knowing exactly what to say. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she knew the answer. Emma Richardson left the Oval Office with her mind spinning. The President's question had shaken her more than she expected. Why did you join the Air Force? She had always told herself it was because she wanted to serve, because she wanted to make her father proud. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. Before she had a chance to fully process her thoughts, a White House staffer approached her once more. "Lieutenant Richardson, there's someone who would like to meet you." Emma frowned. "Who?" The staffer only offered a small smile. "You'll see." She followed him down the long, quiet corridors of the White House. The portraits of past presidents seemed to watch her as she walked, their silent gazes making the air feel heavier. Finally, they stopped in front of a small, private room at the far end of the hall. The staffer knocked gently before pushing the door open. Inside, an elderly woman sat gracefully in an armchair near the window, her posture straight, her uniform neatly pressed. Though her hair was silver, her eyes were sharp and filled with an intensity that told Emma this was a woman who had seen things most people never could imagine. The woman looked at her, and for a long moment, they simply studied each other. Then she spoke. "Lieutenant Richardson, I've waited a long time for this moment." Emma instinctively straightened her posture. "It's an honor to meet you, ma'am." The woman's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "My name is Eleanor Mitchell. I served in the Air Force, just like you. And a long time ago, I had the privilege of knowing your father." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She knew him. Mitchell's eyes softened. "Your father saved my life." The room suddenly felt smaller. Tighter. Emma clenched her hands at her sides, her heart pounding. She had heard stories about her father's bravery all her life, but never from someone who had been there. Never from someone who had lived because of him. Mitchell continued, her voice calm but filled with something deeper, something that sounded almost like regret. "We were on a classified mission. Our squadron was ambushed, and I was shot down behind enemy lines. There was no way out. But your father..." She paused, exhaling as if the memory itself was still too vivid. "He came back for me. He didn't have to. But he did. He held off the enemy long enough for my team to escape. And because of that, I lived. But he... Emma swallowed hard, already knowing how the story ended. Mitchell reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. Before he left on that final mission, he gave me this. He told me that if he didn't make it home, I had to make sure his daughter got it someday. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. It was old, the paper slightly yellowed with time, but the ink was still clear. It had been carefully preserved for decades. She stared at it, her breath shallow. This is it. The one thing she had always wanted. A piece of him that wasn't a medal, wasn't a story from someone else's memory. It was his own words. Mitchell's voice was soft. Go on, Emma. Read it. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Emma carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the letter inside. The handwriting was strong, deliberate, her father's. My dearest Emma, it began. If you are reading this, it means I didn't make it home. Her throat tightened. The words blurred slightly as tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to keep reading. I struggled with whether or not to write this, because the last thing I ever wanted was to leave you with pain. But if I'm not there to tell you in person, then at least I want you to know this, I have always loved you. Even if I couldn't be there to say it myself. Emma pressed her lips together, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I don't know what kind of person you've become. I don't know if you love flying like I did, or if you've chosen another path. But whatever you do, Emma, promise me this, you don't have to live in my shadow. You don't have to carry my legacy as a burden. You only have to be yourself. She inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the fragile paper. All her life, she had tried to become him. To prove she was worthy of the Richardson name. To be a warrior, a pilot, a soldier that he would have been proud of. But now, reading his words, she realized, he had never needed her to do any of that. He had only ever wanted her to be happy. Her hands trembled as she continued. Life will test you, Emma. There will be days when you feel lost, when you feel like you're not good enough. But I need you to remember this, never let fear decide your fate. Stand tall, even when you feel like you're falling. And if you ever need to find me, just look up at the sky. Because no matter where I am, I'll always be watching over you. Emma let the letter slip slightly in her hands as a sob escaped her throat. For years, she had been searching for him. In the medals, in the expectations, in the uniform she wore. But he had never been in any of those things. He had always been here. Right inside of her. Mitchell watched her, her own eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. After a long moment, she finally spoke. Your father was a great man, Emma. But so are you. Emma let out a shaky breath, nodding as she wiped her tears. For the first time in her life, she felt like she wasn't chasing something she could never reach. She wasn't just Robert Richardson's daughter. She was Emma Richardson. And that was enough. Emma Richardson sat frozen, her father's letter trembling in her hands. The words, written decades ago, felt as if they had been meant for this exact moment in her life. Every line, every stroke of ink, carried the weight of a love she had spent her entire life searching for. She had always believed she needed to earn her father's pride, that if she became a great pilot, if she carried on his name with strength and honor, she would somehow be closer to him. But here, in his own words, was the truth she had never allowed herself to consider. You don't have to live in my shadow. The words pierced through her like a bolt of lightning. For as long as she could remember, she had been running, not towards something, but away from the fear that she would never be enough. She had convinced herself that wearing the uniform, pushing herself to the absolute limit, becoming the best, these things would bring her closer to her father. But now, sitting here, she realized she had spent her whole life trying to be someone she was never meant to be. Tears blurred her vision as she continued reading. Life will test you, Emma. There will be days when you feel lost, when you feel like you're not strong enough. But don't let fear decide your fate. Stand tall, even when you feel like you're falling. Emma exhaled shakily, pressing the letter against her chest. For years, she had been afraid to admit her doubts. She had ignored the quiet voice inside her that wondered if this path, this life, was truly hers. She had believed that questioning her choices meant she was weak. But her father, the man she had spent her entire life trying to honor, was telling her the exact opposite. She wasn't meant to be a shadow of him. She wasn't meant to carry his name as a burden. She was meant to be Emma Richardson. Mitchell, who had been sitting silently across from her, finally spoke, her voice calm but filled with knowing. He loved you, Emma. More than you'll ever know. Emma wiped her tears with the back of her hand, nodding. I spent so many years trying to prove myself to him, she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. But now I realize, he never needed me to. Mitchell gave her a soft smile. No, he didn't. Emma let out a shaky laugh, half in relief, half in disbelief. How had she spent so long believing she had to earn something that had always been there? She looked down at the letter again, rereading the final lines. And if you ever feel lost, just look up at the sky. Because no matter where I am, I will always be watching over you. Emma lifted her gaze to the window, where the sky stretched endlessly beyond the glass. She had spent so many nights staring up at the stars, wondering if he was out there somewhere. Now she knew. He had never been in the medals or the expectations or the whispers of admiration from strangers. He had never been in the rigid mold she had forced herself to fit into. He had been here all along. In the love her mother never stopped reminding her of. In the lessons that had shaped her into the person she was today. And most of all, in the freedom to choose her own path. For the first time in her life, Emma felt lighter. She wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in her life, Emma Richardson felt like she could finally breathe. Her entire world had been built around a single idea, that she had to follow in her father's footsteps to truly honor him. That if she could match his strength, his courage, and his sacrifice, she would somehow feel connected to him. But now, with his letter still clutched in her hands, she realized she had spent her whole life chasing something she never needed to prove. Her father had never asked her to be him. He had only ever wanted her to be herself. The weight she had carried for so long, the pressure, the expectations, the fear of not being enough, suddenly felt lighter. She had spent years pushing herself beyond her limits, holding herself to an impossible standard, believing that if she fell short, she would be failing him. But he had never set that standard for her. She had. And now, for the first time, she was ready to let it go. As she stepped back onto the Air Force Base, the world around her felt different. The same concrete runways stretched before her, the same fighter jets lined up in formation, the same cadets moving through their training drills. But something inside her had shifted. She wasn't here because she had to be. She wasn't here because of duty, or obligation, or the belief that it was the only path she could take. She was here because she chose to be. Nearby, she spotted a young cadet, Jason, one of the newest recruits, standing alone by a jet, his expression tight with frustration. She had heard rumors that he had been struggling in flight training, that he was on the verge of giving up. She walked toward him, her boots hitting the pavement with quiet confidence. "Rough day?" she asked. Jason straightened up instantly, snapping to attention. "Lieutenant Richardson." She chuckled softly. "At ease, Jason." He hesitated before sighing. I don't know if I have what it takes. I keep messing up. Maybe I'm just not meant to be here." Emma studied him for a moment before reaching into her pocket, pulling out the old pilot's insignia her father had left behind. She placed it in his palm, closing his fingers around it. "You know who this belonged to?" she asked. Jason shook his head. "My father." He was a legend. A hero. But do you know what he wanted more than anything? She paused, looking him straight in the eye. For me to find my own way. Jason stared at her, processing her words. You don't have to be perfect, Jason. You just have to decide if this is what you want. Not because of anyone else. Not because of expectations. But because it's right for you. For the first time, Jason's expression softened. Do you think I can do this? He asked quietly. Emma smiled. I know you can. That evening, as Emma Richardson sat alone in her quarters, she pulled out her phone and hesitated for a moment before dialing. The familiar ringing filled the silence, and then a soft voice answered. Emma. Her mother's voice was warm, surprised. It's late, sweetheart. Everything okay? Emma exhaled, a small smile forming. Yeah, Mom. I needed to talk. There was a pause on the other end, and then a knowing gentleness in her mother's voice. You read the letter, didn't you? Emma swallowed hard, nodding even though her mother couldn't see her. Yeah. I did. Her mother sighed, and in that one breath, Emma could hear the weight of years of silence. Your father loved you, Emma. More than anything in this world. When he left, I was afraid you'd never truly know that. But now you've heard it in his own words. Emma closed her eyes, gripping the old pilot's insignia in her hand. I spent my whole life trying to be someone I thought he wanted me to be, she admitted. I thought if I became a great pilot, if I was strong enough, I'd finally be close to him. But Mom, he never wanted that. Her mother's voice softened. No, sweetheart. He never wanted you to carry that weight. Emma felt a tear slip down her cheek, but for the first time, it wasn't from pain. It was from understanding. I wasted so much time thinking I had to prove something. It doesn't matter when you realize it, Emma, her mother said gently. What matters is that you do. Silence stretched between them, not heavy, but full of something deeper, relief, love, and years of unspoken understanding. Mom, Emma said after a moment, her voice steadier now. I don't want to live in Dad's shadow anymore. I want to live my own life. There was no hesitation in her mother's response. Then do it, Emma. But remember, you don't have to do it alone. Emma froze, her mother's words sinking in. For so long, she had convinced herself that she had to be strong on her own. That needing help, needing support, was a weakness. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe letting people in, allowing herself to lean on those who cared about her, was its own kind of strength. A soft smile touched her lips. Thank you, Mom. For always being there, even when I didn't realize it. Her mother chuckled, her voice filled with warmth. I always will be, sweetheart. Just like your father. Emma glanced out the window, where the night sky stretched endlessly above her, stars scattered like pieces of something greater. She had spent so many years searching for him up there. Wondering if he was watching. Now, she knew the truth. He had never been lost. He had always been right here, in the love of the family he left behind, in the lessons he had unknowingly passed down to her, in the freedom he had given her, not to follow in his footsteps, but to choose her own path. For the first time in her life, Emma wasn't searching anymore. She was ready to move forward, not as Colonel Richardson's daughter, not as the legacy of a hero, but as herself. And that was enough. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold as Emma Richardson walked across the airfield. The familiar hum of jet engines filled the air, a sound she had known since childhood. But today, it felt different. Lighter. Free. For years, every step she had taken in this place had been weighed down by expectation, by the belief that she had to prove something, that she had to live up to a name that was bigger than herself. But today, she wasn't here to prove anything. Today, she was here because she wanted to be. A few feet away, Captain Miller, her first flight instructor, stood waiting for her. His sharp eyes studied her carefully, as if he could sense something had changed. "Ready, Richardson?" he asked, but his tone was different this time, less like an order, more like a choice. Emma smiled. "More than ever, sir." Miller nodded approvingly. "We're flying a special mission today. A formation flight to honor those who came before us." Emma felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but this time, it wasn't from doubt. It was pride. Not the kind that came from medals or achievements, but the kind that came from truly understanding why she was here. She climbed into the cockpit, strapping herself in as the aircraft came to life beneath her. The roar of the engines, the rush of adrenaline as the throttle pushed forward, it was all the same, yet entirely different. Because this time, she wasn't flying for her father. She wasn't flying to chase a shadow. She was flying for herself. As the jets lifted off the runway and climbed into the vast sky, Emma glanced at the endless stretch of blue ahead. The world seemed boundless, open in a way she had never felt before. She took a deep breath, then, almost instinctively, whispered, "Dad, I know you're here." Just then, a gust of wind swept past the aircraft, rattling the wings slightly, almost as if answering her. Emma smiled. For the first time, she wasn't searching for him anymore. She had found him. And, more importantly, she had finally found herself. Emma Richardson's story was never just about becoming a great pilot. It was about something deeper, about discovering who she truly was beneath the weight of expectation. For years, she had believed that legacy was something she had to uphold, something she had to carry like a burden. She thought that honoring her father meant following his exact path, living his dream as if it were the only option. But now, she understood the truth. Legacy wasn't about repeating history. It wasn't about chasing a name. It was about forging your own path while carrying the lessons of those who came before you. Emma had spent her entire life asking herself if she was enough. If she had lived up to the name Richardson. If she had made her father proud. But standing here now, with the open sky stretching infinitely before her, she realized she had been asking the wrong question all along. It was never about being enough for someone else. It was about being enough for herself. Her father's love had never been tied to her achievements. It had never depended on her rank, her skill, or whether she wore the same uniform as he once did. It had always been unconditional. And now, Emma finally allowed herself to embrace that love. Not as a burden. Not as an expectation. But as a gift. A gift that gave her the freedom to choose her own destiny. So she did. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't walking in someone else's footsteps. She was writing her own story.